Why are we hearing fewer threats of nuclear war coming from the Kremlin? Several people asked that in DMs. So, and people were basically asking, is this because there is the Chinese factor that's obstructing Putin's capacity to go nuclear? And is it because Western powers have made very clear the consequences to Mr. Putin of what will happen, including what will happen to him if he uses nuclear threats, is that the Kremlin has, in its own mind at least, more strategic resource now. In other words, it's mobilized, it can continue the mobilization process incrementally and then speed it up probably soon. And that has not led so far to significant backlash from the Russian population. So the difference between now and September 2021 time, let's say, is that the Kremlin is not feeling backed up against the wall. As the Kremlin comes to be backed up against the wall in the future, we can forget about this story of Putin has been warned, he knows not to do it, regime speaking like that again. Not at all. The nuclear threats are going to come right back as soon as the Kremlin is feeling in a more cornered and vulnerable position. Hello, everybody. Now, you're still hearing me, right? You're still hearing me? Because I'm getting insecure about this now. Why has there been no reaction to the number of Russian dead soldiers? Brilliant. Thank you so much. So, Russia, who are very, very serious, very, very responsible, have come out with their own analysis recently, which I've just jotted down. And that's that they are proposing a very broad bracket of possible casualties. That's to say, up to 290,000 Russian losses. And that's not killed, that's killed, injured, or lost in some other way. And an estimate, so that's, I think, something like between 100 plus and 290,000 Russian losses, and between 30,000 and 90,000 Russian dead, they're estimating. And that is, even the lower end estimates of this are incomparably greater than the Russian losses in Afghanistan. So the problem we've got is that it's just impossible to underestimate how depoliticized Russia is. And it's impossible to underestimate how far consciousness about losses is struggling to convert into a kind of civic awareness of the situation that is to do with, belonging to this strange civic entity called Russia. That's to say, people are thinking it affects others, and insofar as it affects all of us, we might think of that in regional terms. But not sufficiently in national terms. There is no science about this. So there is no clear idea that anybody has about whether there is a tipping point here that might snap. But my suggestion is pessimistic, that we could be looking at losses of up to 500,000 without the population waking up. Nicole, thank you so much. Now, is there an economic case for Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Well, there is always an economic case, but there is also a counter-economic case. There is the clear recognition in the Kremlin that this war wasn't going to be to their economic advantage. And this is a kind of a large-scale replay of the situation in 2014. In 2014, Putin said, this is what we're doing. We're going to confiscate Crimea and so on. This is what we're doing. And the economic branch of the regime came to Putin and said, well, this is not good. These are going to be the consequences. And he said, mitigate them. I'll do the politics. You do the mitigation along economic lines. So what happened with this war was rather the same. They didn't expect the same kind of economic calamity that happened, but this was a conscious exercise in economic self-harm by the Kremlin. And don't believe anybody who tells you that there is some economic advantage that is consciously driving the Kremlin here. It is not. It is clear economic self-harm for the benefit of other advantages that matter more. What is the most rational reconstruction that you can do of Putin's reasons for war? We've got to be clear. It's dangerous. We discussed this a little bit in the nuclear video on the main channel. It's dangerous to have our idea of rationality be too narrow. And it's dangerous for our idea of rationality to have stuffed into it our values, which Mr. Putin might not share. So there is a story that makes sense on any terms about the reasons for war, even on narrow rational terms. But then there is another story that's the cause of the war that requires a richer sense of rationality. The narrow sense is regime security. In other words, this is in part war as a mechanism of regime sustenance. War as an externalization, a preemptive externalization of domestic trouble. And that means that we are not talking about war for a particular result along the lines of conquering some land or securing certain positions. It's war that has a functional purpose as an end in itself because it consolidates Putin's regime at home. That at least was the aspiration. And we've talked about how this is a defensive war for Putin in his mind, how he is terrified of an independent and democratic Ukraine on Russia's border, existing when there is instability in Russia, and having the consequence of shifting that instability against Putin's favor and so on. And he has nightmarish images of Saddam and Gaddafi. Now, but there is also this business, the other side of the coin, the same coin, which is a provocation of the West, a declaration of a civilizational challenge against the West, with the expectation that eventually the West, because it is in decline, is going to fail. And I think right at the beginning, Ryan, thank you, Mario, thank you. Right at the beginning of this chat, I saw somebody, I think, ask a question about why the Russians are so committed to this idea that the West is in decline. And it has indeed become a sort of doctrine, right? And part of where the doctrine comes from is the epistemic conviction that democracy isn't real, and that wherever there are claims about it being practiced, that's a facade for other kind of unlovely power relations going on. So there is this external, non-regime security driven story about provoking the West, exposing the weakness of the West, and using Ukraine as a mechanism to do that. And here we do need, I think, a broader conception of rationality, because part of this provocation are various quasi-mystical ideas about Russia restoring its true historical role and true historical destiny. And there's an enormous amount, a real thicket of magical thinking there, some of which we looked at in the Crimea video. So the most straightforwardly rational bit here is this regime security bit, but then there is this challenge to the West, which is meant to accelerate the West's fragmentation, and that's in part imbued with various kinds of quasi-mystical civilizational ideas. Thank you, Jake. And here, I believe it's important to say that Putin is still rational, because I think that people who believe in delusional purposes or delusional ends are still rational if they try to calculate the consequences of their actions. If they think, well, if I do this, what will be the consequences, and will I like them, will I not? And Putin is still doing that, even when it comes to this sort of quasi-mystical stuff. And therefore, we've got to say that there is no part of this war that is justified along lines that that should escape our definitions of rationality. Could Putin have lived out the rest of his life as leader of Russia if he hadn't started the war? So you see, he thought that the answer was more likely to be no if he didn't start the war. But it's turned out to be different. And now he is probably um, somewhere in between, thinking that the totalitarian turn that the war has allowed him to take at home will help him, but also thinking that the regime is now less stable than it was. Ron, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you so much. Some announcements. Now, I didn't know that after you do a live stream, you have to go inside the live stream and untick some boxes in the monetization section. I didn't untick them. I didn't know you had to do that. And so what happened in the last live stream? You got an advert every minute. And that was an accident, and I apologize. I'm certainly open to experimenting with bringing in ads little by little and gently on some of my videos, which I haven't done for many, many months, actually. But that was an accident, and I'm sorry that affected your experience. And I didn't actually understand why the video generated more money than just a couple of cups of coffee, and that's the reason. I've unticked that box now, and I'll try to be more intentional about this in the future. Second announcement. It's going to be a really, really big Patreon Q&A. Patreon-driven Q&A on the chat channel soon. That'll answer all kinds of questions that have come in DMs and on YouTube too. But if you're a patron, then drop your question the next couple of days to me there so that we can answer it properly in this long-form video on the chat channel. So the problem now is that Putin, it's not clear at all that Putin has consolidated his position now. With this war. He has certainly consolidated a set of totalitarian steps at home, and he's certainly concentrated power in his hands, I think, in the sense of making himself more central in decision making, but he's also made himself more vulnerable. Now, I'm going to take some super chats, or whatever they're called, super chats that came in last time that I didn't manage to respond to. And I'm very conscious of that. So let's do it. And Maxifa256 asked, is Putin attempting to claim the moral Christian right as his own across the West, including the LGBTQ, trans, immigrant, Satanism discourse? And will it result in the withdrawal of support for Ukraine from the US? No, Putin is not trying to really seriously claim any such demographic as his own, because this is just a little bit of haphazard political technology. This isn't a serious message, and it's not going to convince serious people who are cultural conservatives. But it could convince some. But it's very important. This is not an ideological position by the Kremlin. The Kremlin does not take all of this stuff seriously. It just uses it exploitatively. And that's why we've seen a few Western commentators and culture warriors like Jordan Peterson fall for this bit of shallow political technology that the Kremlin has been using, which is certainly not a genuine ideological calling card. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. Second question. Vlad, what do you see as the best achievable outcome in this conflict? Relative time works, asked. Relative time works if you're here. I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question on the spot. From a Ukrainian point of view, it's absolutely clear, right? A victory is, first of all, peace that secures Ukraine's territories back, and clear understanding that Russia will not be invading again, and reconstruction post-war. Some of that kind of victory is a victory Ukraine has to win against itself too. So for Ukraine, it's quite clear. But in a global sense, I think that what a victory looks like is beyond Ukraine. It also involves Belarus and potentially Russia. It involves, and this is very optimistic, nauseatingly optimistic, but it involves a victory for the pro-modern democratic republic forces on the ex-Soviet space against the forces of authoritarian imperialism. And these forces are most dominant in Russia, but 20% of the Russian population is vehemently against them. So they're in a kind of alliance with the Belarusians and up to a point with Ukrainians. The Belarusian situation is different to the Russian one. There is more of a clear sense of Belarus as simply being a hostage to its regime, and its regime being partly a hostage to the Kremlin too. But it's this conflict on the ex-Soviet space resolving quite clearly with Russia's retaining its territorial integrity or not retaining its territorial integrity, but one way or the other, this conflict resolving in favor of the modern democratic republic, not just in Ukraine, but in Belarus and either in Russia or on Russian territory too. And Juan asked, what about Russian influence in South American countries? And I think that there's a risk of overestimating it. And I think that there are basically two lines there. One is to counteract any American politicking in the region, and then to mitigate Russia's isolation. You see, it's a mistake to think that Russia is simply isolated when it's isolated by the West. It's very important to see how Russia is trying to form various kinds of compensatory bonds in exchange for the bonds and connections that it has lost. Now, we're going to end this live stream now for everybody who's watching it on repeat. But if there are people here in the live section, I want to take some questions if you've got any. And they are running a little bit quickly, but maybe I can catch them. I have conservative relatives in the US who think Putin is a communist, but they also support the right-wing libertarian politics, which seems to support Putin. How do we explain this? There is nothing communist about Putin. Putin despises communism and likes the Soviet Union for those elements of it which he can cast as being continuous with the Tsarist regime. But folks of the older generation often struggle with these labels, and they keep going around calling Russian leaderships communist, even though nothing of the kind is the case. And that includes the Communist Party in Russia, which is, of course, just a government department. But then the other part of your question is about connections between certain factions in Western politics and the Putinist project. Perhaps, if you like, sort of ideas-based or spiritual connections. And I think the most important thing to say about that is when you're exploring that in somebody's mind, who says, well, Putin isn't really that bad because our governments are all terribly corrupt, they're part of some kind of global conspiracy. But when people say things like that, my advice is twofold. First of all, start local, right? Start with not how they've misunderstood Russian politics, right? But start with where their grievances, mistrust, sense of powerlessness, sense of being lost in relation to their own political institutions comes from. Because this is an externalization of a set of psychological and alienation type dynamics that are local, right, to particular Western countries. Probably they're worse in the United States. So you've got to start local, not start talking about Russia straight away. The second thing is always focus on what lies underneath what you might perceive as disinformation, and that is trust. 9 times out of 10, when somebody has fallen for disinformation really badly, and they are your uncle and you can't get rid of them at the dinner table, it's a trust issue. And you've got to start with that rather than say, here are some factual errors you've made, and there we go, I'm going to correct them for you. And if you weren't foolish, you wouldn't have fallen for them in the first place. Russians are so aggrieved about the tanks. What might they do next? They're not that aggrieved about the tanks, contrary to all of the ventilation you've seen. They are feeling more solid now because they have felt something that was going to be a sort of a black box for them, which is ongoing mobilization. And it seems to them like it's okay. So we've done this and it's okay, and we're continuing to do it bit by bit by bit, and it's still okay. So we're okay because we can always bring in another 100,000, 100,000 after that. So they're not happy about the tanks breakthrough, but at the same time, they are not hyperventilating about it the way we might guess by looking at some Russian propaganda. They feel that they've got some strategic resources to rely on over the next few months. But there's something else I think it's really important to mention about the tanks breakthrough that's political. Don't fall for the mistake that tanks going to Ukraine means that the West now has the strategy that Ukraine must decisively win as soon as possible. Right? That doesn't follow. Rather, you should see the tank breakthrough as part of a series of incremental evolutions whereby the West might well end up doing more and more things it didn't want to do at the beginning because it got there so gradually and felt its way there so gradually and got its slow turning, vulnerable, democratic sort of, giant cargo ship size structures that are these democracies to turn little by little in the right direction. So that's part of this slow evolution, but it's not a clear transference of Western policy from supporting Ukraine to not lose to supporting Ukraine to win. It seems to me that at the moment, though this is pliant, the position of the West is still that we have got to give Ukraine a shot of winning. But that falls short of putting Ukraine in a position where they are likely to rapidly and decisively win. If Russia withdraws from the war and goes through the interior political fallout, what will come of its future? Two things. The best way for Russia to explore letting go its aggressive imperialist obsessions is to lose as decisively as possible in this war, obviously without this war going nuclear, but to lose as decisively as possible in this war. But that's not a guarantee of anything. It's just an important plank. And then come questions about what possible federalization could there be and what mechanisms of disintegration are plausible, likely, and indeed desirable. If the question is in principle, could Russia snap out of this imperialist story? The answer is it's difficult to see it happening all the way. But the idea that that's an impossibility, I think, is a mistake. In other words, Russia has missed democratic opportunities in the past, and it will be presented with democratic opportunities in the future, and it could take or partly take some of them. But this is a story about which we've got to be cautiously pessimistic, right? But not closed-minded. And closed-mindedness here is also kind of self-perpetuating, especially if the Russian opposition fall for it. If the Russian opposition say, well, Russia is bound to stick itself, to get stuck in this kind of aggressive imperialist dynamic. I mean, that's just the beginning of this conversation. Ferrari guy, how are you doing? How do you feel about Ukraine demographics and population after winning this war? I'm not an expert on domestic Ukrainian politics. Mm. Ukraine's biggest challenge will basically be the fact that what brings about unity at wartime is not the same as what brings about unity in peacetime. And it's going to be about making this conversion. And that's going to be a turbulent path, and a path that Ukraine will be in some way treading alone with Western support, but alone in the sense of having to answer some of these challenges itself rather than borrowing answers from the West. In many ways, the fact that Western democracies are experiencing a little bit of decline and instability means that they aren't necessarily going to be adequate models which Ukraine could import. So that's one of the challenges. Sylvia, you're so welcome here, and thank you so much. Now, there's lots of questions. Let's have a look what else is going on. If the Putin regime collapsed in a worst-case scenario, what type of system would emerge? Will changes always happen in a way that is top-down and not bottom-up? Paul, thank you so much. I'll come to your question in a second. The odds of a bottom-up revolution are vanishingly small in Russia, but you can never say never in a situation that is so volatile and unpredictable. But a bottom-up revolution is more likely if it's preceded by radical, or at least very palpable, fracturing of the regime at the top. So the bottom-up story is most plausibly going to click in Russia if there is a major fracture at the top. There are plenty of worst-case scenarios for how this goes. And of course, one of the worst is a disintegration of Russia and a loss of clarity about who has nuclear weapons and what's happening with them. Paul, since it's easier to convince a person and a nation of a lie than it is to convince them that they have been lied to, what lies would Russia and its leaders be willing to accept that would enable Russia to withdraw from Ukraine? It's almost embarrassingly flat, the answer, Paul, to that question. The Putin regime is in an existential war. And it thinks of this war as going beyond Ukraine. And capacity allowing, this regime is now completely tied to the perpetuation of a war against the West until the regime ceases to exist. So the flatness of the answer here is that the war that Putin started does not end with the Putin regime still in place. It just doesn't. What you could have is a kind of a lull and a break because there's just no capacity. But Putin is more committed than ever to taking Kiev, more committed than ever to provoking the West. And so there is basically no set of steps we can take that will get us to persuade Putin to get out of Ukraine and to withhold from perpetuating this large-scale war against the West, of which Ukraine is just a front. He has existentially tied his regime to the perpetuation of that war. And that's why it seems to me it's inconceivable that the two get untied, except in a scenario where there is perhaps a removal of Putin, some folks in the regime who are now in the regime staying in power, some getting out, and then there is a scenario where it's not clear if it's the same regime anymore or not, and that arrangement might lead to the termination of this war. But basically, my cartoonish advice is tie this war to the existence of the Putin regime. Bill, hello. Um, well, thank you for all the work you seem to be doing, helping Russians make sense of what steps to take, and in this case, I think again how to get out of the country. Katerina, thank you so much. Let's have a look if there are more questions. Erdogan has benefited very much from this situation. How do you feel about the effect and potential of people like Orban and Erdogan in forming the conflict between the West and Russia? Well, let's just pick one of them. Let's pick Orban. Putin's fantasy is that 3 or 4 Orbans spring up in major Western states. He wants an Orban to run the United States, Germany, and France. And if that happens, that is Putin's central way to victory in his mind. And he thinks that that is stunningly plausible because he believes that even though the West seems to be consolidating, this is just temporary and it's a kind of a dam that might break. And its breakage is inevitable. It's just a matter of time. And that's a fraction of an answer, but it's a little bit of a 2 cents on this. Let's have a look what else is going on. I will a deeply pathological character with significant mental health, but also perhaps some neurological issues. She would manifest, and that preceded the traumas Lenin experienced later in life. Vlad, what are your thoughts about all of these Russians falling out of the window? We need to watch what is happening and take case by case. But one of the things that we shouldn't underestimate, actually, is people genuinely. I think the risk of a civil war, there's a question about the risk of a civil war. Sorry if the live stream is breaking up a bit. How is the sound now? Hello, Edward. How's the sound now? Okay, something is going on. We might begin to gently bring it down to a halt, just because we're struggling with sound. But the risk of civil war in Russia is, I'm afraid, not stratospheric, but it's real. Really, really real. And there's a very important book recently come out about the civil war from 100 years ago. That's very much worth reading, by Beaver. And the risk of a civil war is absolutely not trivial in Russia. Listen, everybody, let's take one last question. And then see how we go. We've seen Bill, we've seen Paul, sporadic buffering. This is so quick, I can't catch a question. There is a video on the chat channel with a preliminary list of books I suggest. I'm going to do a new one with a list of books very, very soon. We will talk about MH17. Does Putin see the Baltic states as part of the West? No, he doesn't. He sees the Baltic states as, he sees all of Eastern Europe. So think of where NATO expanded into since the Cold War. All of that he sees as territory that should be under Russian influence. And the Baltics for him should be under more Russian influence in his mind than other East European states. It doesn't mean that Russia has to simply take them over, but it does mean that there should be a kind of a puppet government there. And let's be absolutely clear. I mean, there is a video on this channel from over 2 years ago where I talk about the Baltic states as being the primary, which is a bad prediction now, but as being the primary risk for a Russian invasion. So there's absolutely no doubt that it could have gone that way too. And that's why there's this extraordinary and understandable feeling of both relief in the Baltics, but also, right, you know this better than me, the sense that we are at war. It's not just Ukraine. We feel we are at war. That's partly why Russian oppositional activity in the Baltics has sometimes got into trouble by not understanding that these countries actually have the consciousness, right, that they're at war with the Russian regime too. Um, if this Ukraine war had gone well for Putin, he would have taken Ukraine and Moldova in some kind of alternate reality fantasy. Then he would have done a buildup of troops on the borders of the Baltic states, perhaps. So this is serious stuff, and it's very important to not confuse ourselves just by looking at Putin's military failures in Ukraine, right? Or confuse ourselves that there's still an ultimately real and dogged aspiration in the Kremlin to take over all of Eastern Europe. Um, I didn't give a Lenin answer, Greg. I just said that Lenin had huge psychopathological issues, maybe had neurodiversity too, had lots of issues as a kid, psychological and possibly neurological. And we're certainly going to talk about his psychopathology at some point on perhaps on the chat channel. Listen, everybody, thank you so much for being with me here. We're going to meet soon, probably next on the chat channel. And I wish you a very good evening or a good morning or a good afternoon. Lots of love. Thank you so much for being with me, and talk very, very soon with a better microphone.